If you were labeled a problem child, diagnosed with a disorder, or said to be resistant to authority, there's a good chance you weren't mentally ill at all. You were just an intuitive child being scapegoated. Many of the problems we see among the young population today, many cases of alleged behavior problems, mental illness, school failure, etc., are better understood as intuitive children being scapegoated. And when you start to understand it in these terms, things can start to make a lot more sense. So there's a standard narrative for understanding these kids that operates on a closed logic loop. That's basically like these kids, maybe they're not conforming to their school or family environment. Maybe they're acting out in various ways. Maybe they're resistant to authority figures. Maybe there's a lot of emotional reactivity. Maybe there are very real problems and issues. And so therefore, they have a mental health disorder or something like that. And we have basically constructed a taxonomy for understanding these things that basically revolves around the individual child and their problems. And we intervene on that basis to basically get them to stop those behaviors, stop those reactions, and then adjust to their environment. This is the fundamental basis for things like child therapy, child psychiatry, the behavior management industry, all these things. And that is those are enormous industries. But this is obviously a very limited and probably in many cases highly inaccurate and ineffective way of approaching the situation. My own experience and everything I've learned since indicates to me that a great many of these cases, if not most, are better understood as intuitive children being scapegoated. So what does this mean specifically? Well, intuitive children are fundamentally picking up on more of the truth of what is going on. They're feeling it in their bodies. They're not just going along with what's expected of them, what they're supposed to do. They're asking more questions maybe about what really makes sense, what's really right, what's beneficial. And very importantly, they're picking up on more of the deeper emotional truth in the people around them. And all of this can be very disruptive to the homeostasis of the social groups that they find themselves in particular their family system, but certainly not just that. And it's fundamentally disruptive to that homeostasis because these groups are very often dysfunctional in a great many ways. And so it's not like people are treating the child's reactions and intuitions with openness and appreciation. No, very often they treat it as a threat. They treat it almost like a virus, and then the scapegoating is kind of like an immune response. So that's very often what this scapegoating dynamic of intuitive children is about. So the way this plays out is instead of reflecting deeply on what the child is reacting to, what are they thinking, what are they bringing to the situation, the people around the child, like parents, educators, mental health professionals, etc., fundamentally have negative feelings toward the child because of the way the child is responding to them and the child's intuitions. But they aren't accountable for those feelings. They don't see that, oh yeah, this is something within me. So they make the child out to be the problem. And it is from there that a kind of narrative that the child is has some kind of mental health problem. It's from there that gets constructed. This is a pattern that's been very well established across different domains. And so then naturally in this kind of situation, the intuitive child is going to suffer a lot. It's going to be very painful for them because this would be an incredibly painful experience for anybody. But could you imagine how difficult and potentially damaging it is for a sensitive child, right? Somebody who is developing? That's very difficult. And so then the really tricky thing is then that can become, that suffering and the reactions and maybe behaviors that come from that can be treated as false evidence of this story that gets constructed, that they innately have something wrong with them. So it kind of becomes used as part of this broader scapegoating dynamic. But of course, it's not accurate to say that they have this innate biological problem. It's that there's a problem arising in the situation. And so for us, if we went through this, we probably never had anyone who really spoke directly to the truth of what we experienced. And so if you're watching this video now, or you're starting to kind of make sense of these things, or you're starting to kind of like do a kind of retroactive audit of your history, this can be like a kind of Copernican revolution. It can be really dramatic, the way that we see our whole past and our whole history in a very different way. And that can be very overwhelming. It can be very exciting. I remember for me, when all this awareness was flooding in, it was really exciting and it was really cool, because it was kind of like my life before then. I'd felt completely condemned, and it's like that was being lifted. And I've just been really expanding ever since. And so now I want to situate this dynamic that we've been talking about in the broader historical and social context. Because let me tell you, this is not just about kids that are said to have behavior problems and they're like intuitive children being scapegoated. This is much, much bigger than that. It's a phenomenon that's been going on for millennia, and it is fundamentally archetypal, and it is recurring. And so what you went through is part of something very big and very important. Again, this pathologizing and scapegoating of kids is a contemporary iteration of a dynamic of intuitive people being scapegoated that's been going on for millennia. And it certainly doesn't have to be this way. I think that we need to push back on this and it needs to stop. But it has been a recurring theme in history. The most archetypal illustration of this is the Cassandra complex, which comes from Princess Cassandra, who was a Trojan princess from the Bronze Age, who was given the gift of prophecy by Apollo. And when she rejected his unwanted advances, he gave her a curse that her prophecies would be met with ridicule and disbelief. So when she had visions of Troy being burned, of a wooden horse being used to destroy the city, she was treated as a lunatic and locked up. So the Cassandra complex is knowing that either something bad will happen or is happening, and not being taken seriously, being met with disbelief and ridicule, and the troubling experience of that, right? How difficult and maddening that can be. This reflects so much of my life, which only became really clear to me as I began to trust myself more in adulthood. So one example is, I remember I'd experienced this in peer groups when I was younger, where like there'd be someone new who would come along into the peer environment, and I just had a feeling like this person sucked. And other people were like, oh no, this person's fine, whatever. And then 3 months later, everybody, like all my friends in that situation, ended up hating this person because of their behavior. But that had to be revealed through behavior. Whereas for me, I could kind of sense this person's character immediately. And so I was able to distance myself immediately. Or I remember often, throughout my life, when little crises will occur in groups of people. Often, people start panicking, but they're not accountable for their own panic and their own fear. And then they'll get in these loops of trying to kind of fix the problem very quickly. And for me, I always kind of had this sense, and increasingly so, have this sense of like, well, if we can afford a couple minutes, let's just pause and see what happens. Or let's just, see if we understand something new, or if some event in the situation occurs that could be a game changer. So you're just giving space for allowing that new awareness to come in. But people are often very stuck in their conditioned loops. They can get arrogant, and so they often don't take seriously what the more intuitive people in the situation are bringing. So the Cassandra complex is the archetypal experience of intuitive people. That is every intuitive child in a factory school. That is probably most or every intuitive child in forced mental health treatment. And especially early on, we might not really be seeing that this is what's actually going on because we've been so gaslit and so taught not to trust ourselves that we don't trust ourselves. But intuitive people being scapegoated is a recurring theme in human history and in the present. There are many, many examples of this. One interesting one is shamans being targeted by colonial powers or like centralized government authorities. These people were specifically in that role because they were highly intuitive. And so by targeting the intuitive anchors of these communities, they could be dismantled much more easily. An example of this is in the late 19th century in the United States. They passed a law basically forbidding these practices among the native population and threatened them with like shaving their heads, forced labor, banishment. These practices were also forbidden in the therapeutic boarding schools that Native Americans were forced into. Similarly, in overseas Spanish and Dutch colonies, they would punish these communities for superstition. So intuitive people across that age were seen as a threat. And I've actually had some experiences in my own life that very much mirrored this. So for example, when I'd hit adolescence, I remember I started having a lot of dreams that were basically very intense psychedelic and mystical experiences. And then when I was forced into so-called mental health treatment as a teenager, I learned very quickly to shut the fuck up about things like this because they were not going to be taken seriously. I was going to be pathologized and potentially punished for them. If I brought that up in any way, I was going to have to pay hell for it. So these things were pathologized because they were treated like a threat to that control structure and the ideologies there. And at the very least, it actually was a real threat to these people's false selves and authoritarian tendencies. Another example of this is in the Soviet Union, when dissidents, writers, intellectuals, and artists would point out that the government was extremely authoritarian and perhaps the economic model being used wasn't working. They would get labeled with sluggish schizophrenia. And the symptoms were things like delusional obsession with human rights, pessimistic thoughts, and philosophical stubbornness. And a very similar thing continues in China to this day with these like highly securitized psychiatric prisons that are called the Ankang system. Another great example is the witch trials in Europe and North America. These women likely had great intuitive abilities about plants, about the emotional causes of a lot of people's physical problems, and the male-dominated authorities in these places didn't like these independent sources of power. And I think that's really what's at the core of all of this, is that these intuitive people represent independent sources of power, because this is powerful. That's exactly what it is. When you can sense the deeper emotional truth in other people, you understand a lot about the world. You understand a lot of the truth of what's going on, because the deeper emotional truth in people is in many cases what's driving a lot of the things across, political and social systems, across economic systems. So I think that those are really, this is a really important faculty. And so intuitive people have a lot to offer in a lot of different domains, like, real political leadership or statesmanship, entrepreneurship, art, etc. And so it can be really exciting to think about what it looks like to really cultivate those things and bring them forward. And in this whole phenomenon where intuitive people are scapegoated, what is really at the core of it, I would argue, is less about outward coercion in most cases. I mean, yes, often that is a very real strong element. But actually, I think what's really at the core of it is less that, and it's more epistemic. Epistemic meaning related to knowledge, truth, how you know what you know. The most critical piece is really about narrative control. It's about getting people to think that these people are mentally ill and crazy so that they won't be taken seriously, so that the maybe what is perceived to be the disruptive truth that they have to offer gets marginalized. So the core of this, I think, is epistemic in that way, and it's about narrative control. And I want to be clear about something here, which is I don't see this as being about being against the world. I don't really see it as being about like tearing down systems and radical change in that way. I think that it's, and you may disagree with that, and that's fine, but I think that it's more fundamentally about like there's been this operating system that has been occurring in a lot of these different systems that marginalizes these intuitive people and marginalizes, it fundamentally just marginalizes these greater truths coming forward. And it does so by marginalizing the people that will be the catalyst of that. And I think it's really about stopping that. And it's about us as a collective integrating whatever it is we need to integrate there so that, we can kind of upgrade things. And so returning to this core phenomenon of intuitive kids who are being scapegoated, there's going to be some percentage of the population that fits this role, right? Like they are the intuitive people there. And so the way that intuitive population gets marginalized today primarily is in this way, right? It's young people in their schooling environment, maybe in their family environment, and that not being tolerated. And then we do the different practices that we do to basically marginalize them. That happens in the mental health system a lot, and it has a lot to do with the way that we are pathologizing kids on such a mass scale, forcing them into therapy, giving them a psychiatric label, drugging them, sedating them, behaviorally modifying them. All these things, I think, much of the time, probably most of the time, are really a part of that. And so if you were one of these people, if this happened to you as a young person, and you're starting to kind of see your history with more clarity, understand that this is part of something much, much bigger than you, and it is part of something very important. And so I hope that maybe provides some relief. I hope maybe it feels exciting and cool on some level. So those are my thoughts on how intuitive children are scapegoated. I really hope this has been helpful for you. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I'm going to have a lot more videos on topics that are related to this, covering different angles of it, different practical aspects. So subscribe so you can get those. Please also share this video with anybody who you think it might be helpful for. I'd really just like to get these things to exactly the people that need them. So I'd appreciate your help in that regard. Thank you for watching this, and I look forward to having you for the next one.